I'm Jen. I'm a UX designer at Deloitte Digital in the experience design team. We're in Cape Quarter, which is that way, I think, a bit disoriented. And, well, based on the talk that Jason and Marco gave, like many of you, I didn't start out in design. What a lot of people don't know is that I actually started out in medicine. The reason a lot of people don't know that is because when I say I started out in medicine, I actually quit 2 weeks before the first course started. And completely changed my mind, maybe I think because I don't like money or something. Did a BSOC science there, and I hung out with these guys. So I did English, psychology, and social anthropology. The guy on the right is the least famous probably. That's Franz Boas, the father of social anthropology. And I even did a biology course, which involved dissecting a snail. Harder than it sounds. They're so tiny. So I really envisioned a future for myself in academia, moving all the way up to professorship, potentially. But by the time I started my master's, I actually got quite disillusioned about the whole thing. And partly I was poor. And I went into advertising. So I did copywriting, copy editing for about 2 years, until my liver couldn't take it anymore. Admin is true. And I moved on to something different, back to being poor, freelancing. So I did a whole bunch of different things, copy editing, copywriting again, research assistants, whatever. Even did some archaeology on the side because I was interested in it, and ultimately ended up though doing a copy editing, starting a business, co-founding a business called Less Us, which was an online personal assistance service. So what it meant was people could pay us money, so 300 Rand a month, they'd get 10 tasks, 10 virtual tasks, which meant they could email something in, and if it could be completed on the phone, over the phone or online, we would do it for them as long as it was legal. Yeah, we even got a lot of requests for getting traffic fines squashed. That was still legal though. And our customers absolutely loved us. I mean, we simply we cracked what it was to make people happy in this space. Unfortunately, we only had 2 customers most of the time. So what we didn't manage was scaling. So in a sense, we didn't really have a successful product. So the only logical thing to do when you fail with a startup, an online startup, is to join another company and start advising other people on how to run successful businesses. So I joined Flow Interactive, which was based in Claremont. So I worked at Flow Interactive as a UX designer for 2 years, and then we were acquired by Deloitte a year ago. So now Deloitte Digital, the experience design team. As you notice, there's no sexy cast TV show cast photo of a UX design team because it doesn't exist, but I'm sure Hollywood is writing as we speak. There'll be love scenes with sticky notes and something. I don't know. The mind boggles. The point of this ramble about my past, though, is firstly that I'm not an expert or expert. I didn't make this word up. Not just because it's a horrible word and it should be killed with fire, pretty much. But because essentially my entire career is a series of changing my mind and making mistakes. And with UX it's no different. I continue to make mistakes. The other thing is that throughout all these different jobs that I've done, there is a single thread running through them, which is having to work on communication skills constantly. So that's why I'm doing this talk. I'm working on my communication skills. And this is the skill I want to talk about today, the skill of communication, which as a UX designer is one of your most valuable assets, I would say. Wireframing, prototyping tools, they'll come and go, different techniques will come and go, but this is a skill that will never go out of fashion, and it's one that you'll be constantly working on. Okay, so I have a question, and based on the previous, Marco's and Jason's talk, I think I know the answer. Have you ever experienced resistance as a UX designer? Have you ever had people say, oh, no, or why is that important, or, gosh, do you guys keep losing me here? No? Okay, great. So is it just me, or I sense from the research there may be 1 or 2 other people, possibly, yes? Okay, So it's definitely, from my experience, something that you keep bumping up against. So although someone has hired you to do a job, so as a consultant, a company has hired, brought you in, they don't seem to want to listen to what you're advising. Or perhaps if you're in a product environment, I mean, you've been hired as the UX person in that company, and yet you keep having people saying no to your ideas. Which kind of leaves me feeling like this. When you've been bumping your head against a brick wall for quite some time, eventually you just devolve into a 2-year-old status in your mind, not in public. But basically what's going through my head is, how can you do stuff without my expert input? Why did you hire me if you don't want to listen to me? Why does no one appreciate good UX? But lately I've been thinking, to scrape myself off the floor, and think about it this way. If people aren't getting it, maybe there's something I need to do. Maybe I need to work harder at demonstrating the value of UX. So how do you demonstrate the value of UX? This is a series of diagrams that we used it at Flow, and now we use it at Deloitte Digital, which we use in presentations and proposals and workshops to demonstrate the value of UX to potential clients. So we start off by saying most products are built by focusing on the business needs. Check whether it's feasible, we can technically build it, and will it make us money? And as UX designers, we know this is what happens. It all falls apart if you're not building something that's desirable. And addressing the user needs and building, that's what keeps it all propped up and makes a successful product. So we then go on to say that actually you should start with the user needs. So putting that at the top of the triangle, pyramid, whatever, is where you should start when it comes to design. So this is a good way of explaining UX to potential clients and so on, but what I have found is this sort of attitude of promoting UX so wholeheartedly is maybe not the best way of working within a team. Because we need to be careful of this. Sometimes you're so focused on getting your UX stuff in there that you kind of forget about the technical constraints or the business needs. Because this is where we're meant to be working. We're meant to be balancing those things as a UX designer, even though we focus on the user needs. Basically, your job as a designer is to solve a business problem. You're still hired by a business within tech constraints by focusing on user needs. So you need to balance the three. And if you don't, this is the experience I've had. This is me. This is everyone else. If you're creating a blocker, people don't try and understand why you're getting so worked up about UX. They just carry on without you if you can't communicate it to them. So, what I'm going to be telling you really is a story about how over the course of a project that went horribly, horribly wrong on a number of levels, which I won't get into, I underwent a major shift in how I thought about what it is that I do as a UX designer, or what it means to be the UX person on a team or in that role on a project. I sort of had this very fixed idea of doing UX was this, and I had to kind of get out of that mode of thinking. And it was hard, and even though I'm telling you I've learned these lessons, I'm continually learning these lessons. I'm by no means a sage who is giving down this wisdom. It's something I consistently have to do. So what did I think I was doing when I started the project? This is what I thought my role involved. I was going to do some contextual research with users. Then I was going to apply that by creating personas. The personas were then going to be mapped out in customer journeys. There'd be wireframes, prototyping, usability testing. So this list of activities and deliverables essentially that I've always done before was definitely part of what I was there to do. Secondly, I sort of envisioned myself, and on many projects you feel this way, right? You're like, you're going to come in there, in a world, one man, you're going to grab the user under your arm and you're just going to bust your way through no matter what happens. And it's hard not to think that way when you're coming up against so much resistance. So I definitely thought my role was to fight for the user. And I've heard that phrase many times. And lastly, I was going to be the UX expert, i.e. people would come to me for answers, because that's why I was hired as the UX person. So not necessarily a completely arrogant way of thinking, merely that people were going to come to me and expect me to have all the answers. Not quite what happened. Over time, I realized that UX is actually a lot bigger than I thought. This little set of deliverables and tick boxes and things I'd have to get through wasn't really covering everything. And consequently, as a UX designer, you may have a lot more to offer than you think in terms of the skills required. You're not necessarily just required to be able to interview really well or smash together an awesome prototype in Agile, but it's about the soft skills like communication, which I'll talk about, that you can use. And you're not going in there to fight for a user. That's not going to go down very well. You're just going to come up against resistance. You're there to negotiate in a way. Even the word negotiation is perhaps a little too reminiscent of people with guns and so on. But I think you get the idea. And lastly, you can't do it alone. And I'm not just talking about, are there other UX people on the team? I'm talking about people who are not strictly the UX people on the team. So the front-end developers, back-end developers, testers, business people, and so on. When it comes to designing a really good user experience, it's always going to be a team effort, and not the case of a lone expert just coming in and dazzling everyone. So, let me tell you about that project that went horribly, horribly wrong. It was an identity and access management project, which means it was all about the secure services layer for a large financial institution. So it's essentially the layer protecting a whole bunch of websites. It's the layer that forces people to essentially have to log in to see anything. So we weren't looking at the sites themselves, merely that layer. So what they needed to do was, they had this already, but they needed to replace the underlying Oracle software because it was out of date. They wanted to simplify the registration process because no one was getting through it. They needed to tighten security due to fraud. So that meant introducing cell phone-based two-factor authentication, so sending a user OTP, linking the cell phone to the account. And they'd also have to migrate the existing users to this new system. So for users, what they wanted was that ultimately more people would use this online self-service. So they had the self-service system. No one was using, well, very few people were using it because it was too difficult to use. And the people that were using the system were struggling to actually solve basic problems, like if they forgot their password, they'd end up calling a call center. So they wanted to move away from that. And in terms of users, there were a vast number of very different users with very different user needs, which made it a little bit tricky. However, in my naivety, I was like, it sounds like it's just going to be a bunch of forms, right? Not very exciting. It's going to be a login form, it's going to be a registration form, just form field, form field, form field. And forms are tricky enough. I mean, enough for Luke W. to write an entire book about it. But as a user, well, from my perspective, it didn't seem like it was going to be that hard. So as I mentioned, I had a series of things I thought I was going to do, and I was going to do those over a period of 6 weeks. So all of the normal activities, and right at the end, I was going to hand over my fantastic Agile prototype to the developers, who were then going to go and make it happen somehow. Because that's how it actually worked before. But at the kickoff meeting, that picture got dashed a little bit. We were going to be doing it in an Agile way. How familiar are you guys with the concept of Agile? Yes-ish, sort of. Who wants to come up and explain it? No, just kidding. So just on a very, very high level, I know the UX plus Agile is a whole debate in and of itself, so I won't go into that. But just basically, waterfall is when you do things in those series of activities, and right at the end, you release something and it goes live, and there's a lot of risk involved there. Whereas with Agile, you're continually doing small slices of that and gradually improving, so you reduce risk. And at the end, every little red strip, so at the end of every 2 weeks, you've got a piece of working code that you can actually work with. So what it means for a UX designer is that you're working a lot closer with developers, because design and build are wrapped up very closely. So back to this project. So that 6 weeks turned into 15 months for a number of reasons. But right at the beginning of the project, I was starting to get frustrated, or partly because I had no experience in Agile, so I just felt like I didn't know what I was doing, but we did have some training courses. But mostly because there was this delay in getting started. The tech team seemed to still be waffling on about some solution design, something or other. It went completely over my head. But it became apparent that the old and the new Oracle software would have to coexist for a while. So in my mind, I was like, can they not just get on with what they need to do, make a decision so that I can actually do my job, what I came here for? And I sort of got very, very distressed. Eventually went to chat to Phil Barrett. Some of you may know, he did a workshop yesterday. He's my boss. And he said, well, Jen, why don't you just get started, just draw something, just do. And it dawned on me, as I started to listen to the concerns that the tech team were having, is that they were having trouble making this decision because they were having trouble explaining exactly what the different options were. So having these two bits of old and new software had implications for the users, as I started to realize, but they didn't really know how to move on from there. So what I did is I started to visualize the problem for them. And I started drawing journeys of what would happen if they went with one option or the other option. Essentially, the problem they were trying to solve is this. Some sites would be protected by new software, which had a higher level of security. New users registering would have that high level of security. Existing users wouldn't have that high level of security. So accessing the high level of security would be difficult. Moving between the two systems would also be difficult, because you'd essentially need two sets of credentials, i.e. a separate username and login, which sounds like a nightmare. We know users can't remember their one set of credentials. They're definitely not going to remember two. So they were figuring out how people could move between. But what became apparent from this is that there was definitely going to need to be a process by which that existing user got access to this. And so that informed the whole design and an entire user journey that we had to figure out in the end. So the point of that is that when I stopped saying, yes, I'm not interested in your tech, just do your little thing so that I can do my thing, I realized that there was a new opportunity to demonstrate value. When I drew these journeys for them, it was the first time that they sort of seemed happy that I was even there. Because I was demonstrating some value. And they were able to use those to communicate to stakeholders when it came to making those decisions. So ultimately the lesson for me there was demonstrating your value can take an unexpected form. And you may be having to do things that you didn't expect you were going to be doing on the project, like drawing semi-technical-ish diagrams that I didn't know that much about. But what was really going on here, that's me again, when you get all frustrated and you're like, why can't I just do my job? What you're actually saying is, my needs, what I've come to do, is more important than yours. That is, in essence, the life of a 2-year-old, is realizing that other people have needs as well. And that's what happens as they realize it. But what was happening also was I was inside a bubble. I was in my little UX bubble. All I could think about was my little set of end users that I was always used to focusing on, and I wasn't even thinking about the wider team or how I was interacting with them. So a bubble basically is the space in which ideas seem obvious. It's your little self-sealing, self-reinforcing logic that all of us have. It's not abnormal to have this, but it is problematic when you interact with other people. So I went to an interesting talk recently by David Gray, and he was also talking about bubbles on a slightly different level. So as I said, a bubble is the space in which your ideas seem obvious, when people disagree, they're essentially battling for the obvious. Both of them have their obviouses, whatever the plural is of that, and they're bumping up against each other. I mean, you can see it in every online rant on a, well, I think News 24 doesn't have comments anymore, but when they did, essentially. Excuse me. So we all have our own bubbles. So what is that? What is the experience of that within a team? Well, I know from my perspective as a UX designer, when I speak to devs, my attitude is often something a bit like this. It's like, here's the design I've done. You're the magical tech person. Make it happen. You can do anything, right? Code can do anything. Without an appreciation for what that actually meant. And when it comes to stakeholders or clients, this is often what I'd be feeling. I can't believe you're making such bad decisions. Like I literally can't believe it. I just can't understand your brain. Obviously, I would never say that out loud, but I don't know about you guys, but that's something I've had internally. So how do you go about breaking bursting a bubble if we're all in these bubbles? Well, this is where you, as UX designers, now I know that you're not all UX designers, there are some devs in the room, but this is where a UX designer gets to use the skills you've already got, so your skills of communication and empathy, those skills you've been practicing so well on your end users, you get to use those in redesigning the service you offer to other people. So if you think of you being a UX designer as a service or a product experienced by the people in your team. So what does empathy mean in terms of this bubble language? It's essentially, you're trying to get inside. So when I said I literally can't understand what's going on inside your head, that's what you need to do. It's what you do with users. You do it by interviewing them and then really getting to understand what is the life of a truck driver like, or whatever your user happens to be. And it may be someone you knew nothing about when you started that interview. So this is what empathy means. So this is the sort of thing I've been thinking about. If we think about the service we offer, the service that people are buying in terms of clients are hiring you, but they're not buying once you're on the project. What if you thought about it as a product that you could sort of shape based on the needs of the users? So who are your users? Well, devs. As a UX designer, you're going to be working with devs. I know saying devs as a whole is a bit reductionist. Front-end devs, back-end devs, architecture, etc., etc. As a UX designer, you're probably going to work with front-end devs the most. So you should definitely think about what is the experience for a front-end dev like when they come into contact with a UX designer and your designs, etc. And then also clients. So if you're on a consulting side of things, you'll have clients. If you're in a product company, then you can think of it as business stakeholders, perhaps. So how do we get to understand our users? When we do normal usability or user research, we ask these questions. What are their goals? What are their needs? What are their frustrations? So are there any devs in the room? I know there's one. Yay. If any of you have had to work with a UX designer or designer before, what have been some of your frustrations? It's perfect. It's absolutely perfect. Okay. Well, some frustrations I've heard from developers is that designers aren't thinking about the medium in which their designs are ultimately going to be made real, because they don't know enough about it. So they come up with designs that are going to be very difficult to make in terms of being scalable or working on mobile or working on the browsers, etc. The one thing I do know about a good dev is always looking for a way to be more efficient. And that doesn't mean lazy, that means writing elegant code, reusable code, relying on existing components rather than customizing everything if possible, because that leaves more time to do different things. And then they're also dealing with constraints, like I mentioned, breakpoints, browser issues, possibly legacy code. The project I was on had severe amounts of legacy code. So they've got all of this going on in their minds, and then you come with your designs as a UX designer, and you're just not interested. Don't give me problems, just make this happen. It's kind of sometimes the experience. So how do you get away from that? Well, like you do with your normal users, you ask questions, and this is something I've had to do a lot. And you listen to the answers, and then you ask the question again because it was technical and maybe it went over your head, but you really want to understand. And so devs need to be a bit patient when it's a bit confusing. But my experience is that when an engineer or dev says something can't be done or no, there's always a good reason behind it. And the reason they don't tell you is not because they think you're stupid, but because they think you don't care. Like, why would I bother explaining a whole thing to you? You're clearly not interested. So you don't need to understand the intricacies of what it is to be a dev. You're not a dev, you're a designer. But you should definitely be interested in it because you're communicating your ideas and your designs to someone who is interested in those things. And you need to find that common ground. And you can also learn things. Oh, yes. Working with devs can teach you something. So the one thing that I realized on this particular project, as I said, it was loads and loads of forms, so essentially just bunches and bunches of fields. And I'd drawn up some wireframes, the devs had built them, and I noticed when a form was submitted and there were errors, what would happen is the page would just hang at the bottom, like where the button was, even though the error had happened on the first field, so you couldn't see what had happened. And I was like, that's weird, why isn't it scrolling to the top of the page where the error is? And the devs were like, well, you didn't specify that. I was like, oh yes, it's actually a little piece of code that someone has to write and someone has to specify and someone has to think about. And I really started to think much more about the intricacies of sort of micro interaction and UX. And then when it comes to your stakeholders or your clients, what are their goals and needs and frustrations? Obviously, a lot of the time they're worried about budgets, money, because that's what they need to manage. They've got KPIs they've got to meet. But they also have emotional needs, like everyone, to be relevant and validated. So imagine the experience for a client when you come into their company and basically say, everything you're doing is wrong. You can imagine on an emotional level, like it goes right past logic. It's just, you're basically saying, I'm irrelevant. So you need to think about how you're going to help them on this journey with you, not just come in Bruce Willis-like, blazing guns, telling them that it's all wrong. On this particular project, I found that communicating had to be done in a way that was meaningful. So for a stakeholder, money is often meaningful. So if I would say this particular UX issue is a real problem, they'd be like, meh, it's going to take 2 weeks to do it. We don't have time for that. It's going to cost us money. So I go, well, the result is going to be extra calls to the call center. That's going to push costs up. And then it was like, oh, okay. You're saying literally no one's going to be able to move past the screen. That's going to result in calls to the call center. So instead of just focusing on the screen, focusing on what was meaningful to them. Another thing is, so back to facepalm, I can't even believe you're saying this or thinking this. A lot of the time, stakeholders are making decisions on sort of misinformation or they've misunderstood something, particularly when it's technical and they're not technical. They're, like, for example, they're from the business. So that's also somewhere where you as a UX designer could maybe use your communication skills to help make a little more real what's actually happening within the team and on the tech side of things. An example from this project, excuse me, there was a real usability problem that I came across in terms of the password policy. So the password policy that had been mandated that had to be used for this new system consisted of the usual things like must have an uppercase, a lowercase, a number, a special character. That kind of thing can't be your first name. But then it had this additional requirement that the password could not consist of a dictionary word. So literally almost every password you ever made. And security was adamant that this was a requirement. And I was like, but and so I didn't know how to I just kept getting told, no, this is a requirement. So within the context of a demo, when I had a room full of stakeholders, what I did was I dramatized that experience. I dramatized the experience of an old woman in her 50s who was trying to sign up for the secure services thing. Her daughter was sort of helping her, and she got to the password, and then I dramatized the exact, and she tried over and over, and she couldn't understand why she kept getting it wrong. And gradually the stakeholders in the room were like, but who agreed to this password policy? And then the security architect was, you guys. And they're like, no. She's like, yep. And they're like, oh. So immediately, before that meeting had even ended, I'd already managed to get that change, not agreed to because I had to go through 5 million ratifications, but essentially agreed to. And it was just through communicating that problem in a different way. And what was also useful, so again with running those demos and talking to stakeholders, was when you're building something like secure services from a UI perspective, you just get to see the login screen week after week. A bajillion things have happened in the back end, but there's nothing to really show stakeholders. And so what was useful was to be able to somehow communicate to stakeholders in a more visual way what was happening behind the scenes, so that they could understand and value the work that the team were doing when from a UI perspective, it looked like nothing had really happened for weeks. So this becomes a lot more realistic when you're trying to understand the perspective of your users, of your UX service. So the lesson from that really is you can't come in guns blazing, fighting for the user. You're not going to win. You need to negotiate. There's things about the tech side of things and about the business side of things that you don't know. And you don't know how this is going to impact the usability or the user experience that you're busy designing. So you can't just focus on your screen. You have to negotiate what that will mean with designers, with devs, and with stakeholders. So negotiation essentially consists of active listening, and I know UX designers can do this. Empathy, yep, we're pretty good at this. Building rapport, yeah, you've got to do that in interviews anyway. Influence, and then behavior change. That comes from the FBI, that's for hostage negotiation, where behavior change essentially means releasing the hostages. They call it the stairway model. By stairway model, it means you've got to do them in that order. And I think sometimes, for myself at least anyway, I want to come in at number 4 with stakeholders anyway, or stakeholders or clients, and possibly even devs, but not go through the first 3 steps of having any kind of rapport. Now I know maybe what you're thinking is negotiation sounds a lot like compromise. Promising. And this is, as UX designers, the concept of compromise is probably one of our biggest fears, because it's a slippery slope towards ending up polishing a turd. I don't know if you've heard that phrase. It's essentially when you're so constrained by the tech constraints or the business needs that you end up building a user experience that's really second best, just sort of slapped a thin user experience-y layer slapped over a horrible system. So I'm not advocating compromise by trying to manage the 3 circles, but you should push the limits of and question, are those tech constraints really tech constraints? Is there a different way things can be done? Are those business priorities, is that deadline really a deadline, or is it movable? Or does that thing really have to be created, but for on the other hand, you need to prioritize your own recommendations. So if you're saying this needs to change, I want this build, I want this build, I want this build, this is what we have to have a good usable system. You also need to think about which of them are must-haves and which of them should, could, and will. So It's called the Moscow Principle, the Scrum. You need to be able to do that with your own work and be quite relentless about what is necessary and what can maybe wait. So what happens when you do all of these things? Well, in my experience, this is an awesome stock photo. When you empathize and you start to collaborate, people suddenly respect you. So you remember that little diagram of the path going around me? That stops happening. People start inviting you to meetings. Now, meetings aren't the best thing ever. They are kind of a waste of time often. But particularly within a corporate environment, when you miss out on meetings, you often miss out on where decisions are made. And that was the sort of thing that was happening. Someone would come in and be like, yes, there was this high-level architecture meeting, and anyway, this has been decided. And then I'd go, what? But that's going to mean this and this and this for the user. How could you decide that? And then it would be like another 2-3 weeks of emails going back and forth. So once I started to really understand, on a high level, understand the sort of the tech behind what we were building, I could draw diagrams and I could visualize it. Then I started getting invited to meetings where I was made useful. So what that meant was I was there when those decisions were made and I could influence them. And also shortened the feedback loop. It didn't end up in 3 weeks of back and forth emails. Ultimately, what starts to happen when you collaborate like this is that your team starts to contribute. They start to get a sort of a UX mindset. It's not their focus, but they do start to recast what they're doing in terms of UX needs. So one example of that was we had this issue, or rather, I didn't know this was an issue at all. The devs realized this was an issue because they were thinking about UX. So what happened was, when you logged in with your username and password, on the top right of the page, we would display your username, the username that you logged in with. And the way that worked was, the name you logged in with was captured in the header and then passed along. So every single, on every page, you could then display that, which was great. Except for when you changed your username in a logged in state, what happened was it would update in the back-end database, but until you logged in again, you just keep seeing the same username. So obviously, as a user, if I've changed my username to la, click save, seen a confirmation message, but see that it still says Bob in the top right, I'm going to think it didn't work. So I didn't even know this problem existed. The devs themselves discovered this issue. And they were sort of, I saw them one day sitting in this little huddle, and they're like, oh, what are we going to do? Maybe, huddle. And then I heard my name. And it's like, yes. That's also part of the value of sitting here, devs. And they were like, yeah, we've got this problem, so we're going to just leave this off. We're not going to display the username anymore. So I was like, well, people value being able to see that they're logged in. That's quite a good indicator. Is there something else we can do? So I'm like, well, I know how the back end sort of is structured, and I know that you can pull in the name and surname of the user. So let's just do that. So then on login, every time you log in, because your name and surname doesn't change, right? So essentially that's what they did. It just, you would always just see name, surname, and never see your username, and this problem evaporated. But we could only solve that because I had spent enough time with the team before that, kind of understanding what was going on in the background, and we could come to, and the fact that they realized there was a problem, so together we could sort of figure it out. So it's really awesome when devs start, or team members start coming to you and wanting to make contributions to the UX and going, is that a good user experience? Especially testers, they'd be like, I found that confusing. Should be really great, right? But this is what happened to me. I was like, oh no, people are encroaching on my space. How I am no longer the UX expert if people are going to be making these suggestions. And that ego just came right back. And this is a constant problem, I think, something I need to continue to work on. Basically, when other people start doing UX on your team, you've achieved your goal. So this was essentially my third lesson. Good user experience design is a team effort. there's stuff you don't know, and unless you create a space in which people can talk about it, you're not going to know, but it's going to impact the user experience down the line. And at another talk I was at recently, so this is very meta, it's a photo of a slide of my own slide, etc. if you want to take a photo of it. A UX's role within a project is first and foremost to set up the process for success, not first and foremost to do a bunch of research or first and foremost to draw a bunch of wireframes, etc. It's setting up the process for success. So it's creating that space in which you can work and all worry about user needs. So as a final takeaway, I guess, or conclusion, if you find that you're consistently bumping up against resistance, people are making decisions without consulting you, or they think you're there just to make the interface look pretty, or you've done designs but they get ignored, or people just generally aren't getting it, it may be time to do a bubble check. And just examine, is it there, maybe? What that means is just taking a moment to consider the bigger picture. So as I've said, it's beyond the interface, it's beyond these end users that we always aim for, and you have to think about those users of your experience and how they're receiving your behavior. And empathize with them and understand what's important to them and how you can fit the message you're trying to give in a way that's meaningful to them. And be open to learning, because they've definitely got things to teach you. So you're not a lone hero fighting for a user. You're not Bruce Willis. Sorry. Ultimately, what I feel anyway, based on my experience in this project, is that going forward, my role is to create a space in which users are valued by everyone. Their user needs are valued by everyone on the team. And that ultimately is how I think you demonstrate value in that context.